Hey, everybody. This is Krista. This is Bad at Keeping Secrets. And today I have Andy J. Pizza, host of
Hello.
Creative Pep Talk, and then also with a new book out, Invisible Things. And you're actually the second children's book author that I've ever interviewed. The other one was Sophie Blackall. And
Oh,
I feel like
great.
I feel really excited about this book having a small child, but also being an adult who's trying to learn how to navigate emotions to be able to identify them on a granular level. And I feel like for me this has been a really interesting book, both for Margaret, my daughter,
Mm.
helping her identify her feelings, but also for me in a lot of ways. I feel like it operates on a lot of different age levels and cognition levels. I also think it points to this moment that we're in sort of expanding our perception as humans to things that like affect us in our lives. For example, the interdependence of species, or other forms of intelligence. I think it it's a really exciting time to be alive, also a frightening time. But anyway, thank you, Andy, for doing this with me and talking about your work.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really excited to be here. So thanks for inviting me.
Well, I kind of wanted to start out, we started out a lot with like sort of early exposures to that kind of maybe informed what directions you took in life. And I think a lot of people, or at least me, I wasn't necessarily, my parents weren't necessarily excited about going to art school or studying art or trying to be an artist. But I was wondering if you could kind of talk a little bit about kind of maybe those first memories that you have or how you got into making.
Just yeah, I mean, it's funny because my mom is an artist type. She's a creative type. She didn't end up really pursuing much in that direction. She did when I was little. She had like picture book pitches that she had put together and like sketches and written things. She had a whole book actually that was an alphabet book with a cast of these weird characters. So it's not completely unlike Invisible Things, but you know, I don't know if she has ADHD, but I've got it from somewhere. And if I had to guess, it was probably her. And so, you know, people like that have a hard time following through with stuff, myself included. And I remember, visiting her on the weekend and her one time showing me all these sketches and how she had contacted a publisher and all this kind of thing, and that her book would be coming out soon. And I remember, I think it was second grade. I came back Monday and I think I told the whole class, like, pretty soon we can read my mom's book. And it never ended up, coming to fruition. So I had that creative side that was kind of complicated in the way that I felt about it. But then I really grew up in my dad's house with my dad and my stepmom, who are both, corporate people. And my dad's an accountant. And I think that even though, to my dad's credit, I think he always pushed us to practically dive into the things that we were interested in. And because he just kind of believed that that's your best bet. And so he had that, but he never really fully discouraged me from pursuing art, because I think honestly, he was just like, I don't know what else you're going to do. So like, try this, like that. This seems as good of a bet as anything else. And, but I grew up in the Midwest where, at least where I'm from and kind of the socioeconomic background of my parents and all that, there wasn't a lot of culture. It was mostly pop culture. And, yeah, so, but I was always drawing. I was always drawing cartoons and making my own radio show on my Talk Boy and making home videos. And, I dreamt of going into comedy when I was like a teen. Like I really wanted to be on Saturday Night Live. And so I was always doing creative stuff, but all my references, I didn't really discover like art until I was in probably almost finished with high school. And then that finding like art and culture and indie music and stumbling into a few books that really captured me, that's where I think I started to get on the path that led me to what I'm doing now.
What were the books?
The book I think that most stands out I mean, I was really obsessed with picture books. When I was a kid, there was a handful of books that just blew me away. Like, I mean, I could list a ton of them, but Shel Silverstein and Dr. Seuss, and then John Cheska, like Stinky Cheese Man, all that stuff. I was obsessed with all those books, and I would write a lot of that stuff, and try to write my own versions of stuff like that. But it wasn't until in high school I had I don't know how somehow I had a copy of one of my teacher's books, The Little Prince, and I just randomly read it. I probably read it because it's a small book and I thought I could read that. And I remember reading that book and feeling like my life had changed. I remember and feeling like nobody understood what I was experiencing. And the truth is, the maybe the point of that book, but definitely my favorite quote, is the heart of invisible things. And so the quote is, what is essential is invisible to the eye. It's only with the heart that one can see rightly. And yeah, so that book definitely opened up a side of myself. I think it tapped into the melancholy nature that I had always had in a way that was kind of happy sad, like happy to be sad as a person. So yeah, that was the book, The Little Prince.
I think it's interesting to think about this because I read it in French in high school
Yeah.
and I couldn't remember. And then I also read it to Margaret while I was breastfeeding when she was little. Um, and I remember I don't know why I forgot about the connection between that and invisible things. I mean, it's so there.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit. There's like five different directions, I feel like, from what you just said.
Okay.
I could take this in. But I was wondering if we could take a step back and maybe define when you use the word culture, what you mean by that, and sort of a lack of culture with
Yeah.
where you were growing up.
I mean, like I said, I had a lot of pop culture. Like the main way that we bonded with my dad was going to movies. So, we would go to movies really frequently. And yeah, so I had all that going, but I didn't grow up in a house like no one in the house I grew up in drew pictures, painted, made anything. No one played instruments. I had the odd kind of cousin, or like my mom would be very infrequently in my life and would kind of notice that I had this predisposition to draw and paint and make stuff and come up with characters and all that kind of stuff. And so every once in a while, like every few years, I feel like someone would swoop in and like my cousin took me to a one person show when I was like a teenager. And I remember just thinking that was awesome. And then she took me to the museum, and that, I think that was probably the only time I went to the art museum before I was 20. And so, yeah, and I grew up, I'm still pretty much a huge fan of like 90s R&B. So that's the kind of music I was listening to. And like I said, I still love it. Like I love Boyz II Men. Like that's like what I listened to almost exclusively until I was like 16 or 17. And then I discovered a bunch of bands that were kind of like art rock. And it was like an alternative culture. And I think that was especially interesting to me because this is a common thing now that I've heard a lot of people that are considering themselves neurodivergent say this experience, which is kind of freaky. But I remember as a kid, I would lay in bed when I was like 8 years old, and I would think that my parents, my stepmom and my dad, were maybe actually aliens and had some kind of device to where when I walked down the hall, they would instantly turn back into humanoid looking. And so I definitely I didn't think that was true. I just thought it could be true. It would make as much sense as my life made sense. And so I do think finding like alternative niche cultures that were not mainstream and didn't do everything that normal people did, that was a huge thing for me.
So like, could you say necessarily that you were potentially like you felt different and or something was maybe not, this is Andy as a child and one of these things is not like the others. And
Very
so
much so.
trying to find a space that you felt like you belonged in.
Yeah,
Sounds
definitely.
like.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that was definitely true.
Do you think that, so I'm curious, and it seems like there was like a, not necessarily a moment that happened to you, but like it was always part of your personality to be making something or creating something. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that feeling of, or maybe why you do that, or how the narrative that you're telling yourself on why you do it right now. And maybe if that's changed throughout the years.
Yeah, I definitely think that it has changed because I I I have a podcast where I talk about pursuing a creative path. And I think sometimes that notion gets lumped into a lot of things that it's not. And one of those things is kind of just pursue your dream and everything will be okay. And I never did that. So I can't speak to that. So I can't tell you if chasing your dream 100% will work out for you because I don't know, because I've never done that. Everything I've ever done has always been what I think of as like a daydream interpretation. It's always been, this is kind of what I like to do. And this is the opportunity that I can see in the world to do that. Even, some overlap of those two circles in that Venn diagram. And so, I think the way that it's different is I do it for a living. And so there's a lot of complicated stuff that happens from mixing art and commerce, and so I'm aware of that. I'm also aware. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of pieces there of how to remember to do it for fun, even if you're getting paid for it. I think you have to do a lot of mental tricks on yourself to access that side of you, because it's really interesting, like thinking back to a time where we would create scenarios in public just for fun without cameras, like let alone social media. We didn't, so we were just creating live in the moment, something that would never happen again, purely just for the fun of it. And that was when I was a teenager, we would be doing those things. But I think honestly, probably the biggest through line in my life, and this is a piece that I don't hear a lot of ADHD talk online get to, really, is how significant boredom is to me. Boredom is my arch nemesis. And I've heard some people commiserate with this or relate to this, like boredom for an ADHD person, in my experience, is physical pain. It's like if I'm bored for 8 hours, if I'm at a job where I'm like, hey, stand in this box and take money, I literally leave nauseous. It's a real nausea. My skin's crawling, right? So creativity, I think, was always about that. And even now, and I've even learned, like, there were times in my early 20s where I had to get jobs that were kind of my absolute worst nightmare because.
What were they?
I'll tell you. So I always say, and this is true, like part of the reason I pursued a creative path was because traditional employment, being stuck in the same place, doing a monotonous thing for 8 hours, 10 hours at a time, has always felt like jail to me. And when I was in my early 20s and the recession hit, and I'd done some illustration jobs. I was picking up some momentum, and then all of that just disappeared overnight. It was like 6 months, no jobs, no interest. And the only job I could get that was like, that would pay the bills that we had was my buddy got me a job at this youth shelter. And I didn't realize that I knew it was connected to a juvenile detention center, but I didn't know that if you worked at the youth shelter, you had to pick up shifts at the detention center. And I avoided it forever, but eventually I had to do it. And I'm like, man, I walked back into this like lockdown facility with very few windows. I'm like a few years older than the kids that are in there. Every other person that works there is like twice my size and like scary. And I'm like an emo artist, who's not, like I said, not older than these kids. And I thought the irony of trying everything I could to avoid traditional employment because it felt like jail to in traditional employment in an actual jail. And I think that and it was a very like facing my fear kind of experience. And I think that one of the takeaways was I can be creative anywhere. I would not want to do that job again. I definitely would not. But even with the kids that were stuck in there, and even in my own mind, I am able to be creative. So I can find ways of making it fun, making it interesting. And so I think all through my childhood, that's what it was I was just bored out of my mind all the time. And so that's just the way that you get through it. And the boredom, that's my way of thinking about it, but it's really understimulated. That's the ADHD side of it, is just, I don't know, the dopamine thing's broken. I don't fully understand the science of it, but you need lots of stimulation. I wake up on a -5, where I think a more neurotypical person probably wakes up at a 0 and they're like, okay, I can like coast like this. And I've seen it in my family members that have ADHD. There's like a manic kind of desperation for stimulation, like planning ahead of like, what are we doing later? Where am I going to get this fix if I need stuff to happen? And so I think making stuff has been my way through.
So I'm curious, and this question is potentially maybe something that you can't answer, but in your podcast, you've talked to a lot of creative people who have been able to transform their creative, what they're excited about and interested in, into a way of life, and not have maybe the more traditional sort of 9-to-5 jobs. And obviously you've been able to do this. I've been able to do this. What is the sort of story you're telling yourself about why some people are able to make it happen, or what is special or unique about your practice that kind of lets you ride both of those lines of making things for other people be fun for yourself?
Yeah. I mean, I think that is the question that I'm trying to figure out and answer. And I always start with the same thing that I think any hopefully decent human would say, which is, first and foremost, there's a tremendous amount of luck and privilege. I know that's for sure. I'm a straight white man, and I grew up with, even though my parents came from pretty impoverished families, my dad was pretty successful and became more and more successful. And we had a lot of opportunities that other people didn't. And so I definitely think that coming from that place, I didn't choose to come from that place. So there's tons of things that I have, at least partially because of that. But I also, anytime anyone asks me a question like that, I also think there are a bunch of other things that I do think I've done on purpose that have helped. And just answering with, well, I'm lucky and privileged is almost a different kind of gatekeeping, because now you're actually not sharing the stuff that was helpful to you. So I try to acknowledge both of those things. And for me, I think about this question all the time, because like I said, my mom is a creative person who wasn't so lucky, and it didn't end up working out so well. And I have, I have friends that that were more creative than me that have not been able to stay on the planet for one reason or another because they couldn't figure out a way to get through this life without drugs or self-harm or whatever. So it's a question that I'm always thinking about. And I could tell you 100 things, but the thing I think is probably the number one that is a lesson that I feel like I'm going to have to learn forever, because it's kind of counter how my brain works and how I think a lot of creative people's brains work. And it's the idea that the way I say it is, if there's no booby traps, there's no treasure. So if you're trying to go get treasure, right? And you get to the booby traps and they've all been set off. And in fact, now there's like a paved road to the treasure. And now there's vendors on the side of the road selling you everything to make this journey really easy for you. If that's true, the treasure is not at the end of that road, right? So if you're hitting booby traps, if it's hard, if there are challenges, it means that you're doing something worth doing, right? And so I could give you like specific examples, but if you think of any like art form, like let's talk about, when I got into art, I was doing it through the lens of making screen printed band posters. And when I got into them, it was a hard thing to get into. You couldn't go to Joann Fabrics and pick up all of the kit to screen print stuff because it wasn't widely available. It wasn't mainstream. There were a lot of booby traps. There was a lot of challenges. There was a lot of learning, right? And so, but that also meant that if you went through that challenge, there was more treasure on the other side of that. Okay. So the point I'm getting at is, and I think there's good research around this, is it's essentially the growth mindset. And it's Dr. Carol Dweck's book, Mindset. And it's essentially the idea that growth mindset is you hit a challenge and you think you have the capacity to grow. And so a challenge to someone that has a growth mindset is an exciting proposition because they're like, ooh, this is a puzzle that's going to be like tough. It's going to be fun. And the fixed mindset, which I think, unfortunately, myself included, is something that creators are innately in, is a fixed mindset says, if I have a challenge or a test that is difficult, it might prove that I'm terrible, because if I fail this test, it's not just I didn't overcome the challenge, it's that I am a failure, because you're seeing your talent and your skill as a thing that is not, that's fixed, that can't grow, that can't get better. Your IQ and your, whatever. And I think in the creative world, this is especially relevant because we have so many myths and narratives about how art is about this super talent that's God-given, and you either have it or you don't have it. And so that's a fixed mindset. The whole idea of talent is a fixed mindset. So, and actually, another way of thinking about it is Stephen Pressfield, he talks about it like the resistance. It's basically when you start doing something as a creator, at least for me, there's this voice that says, if this isn't easy, I'm going the wrong way. Like it should just be, everything should just, kind of domino effects positively if I'm going the right way. And I think I've had to like really deprogram that. And I still do. When things are getting hard, when I'm launching a book and it's not, we run into 5 snags or, whatever, I'm trying to do a new episode of the podcast. It's easy. Maybe it's also creators are just more predisposed to superstition or something too, of like, oh, this can't be right because you know, this whole project is cursed, that kind of thing. So I don't know if that that's a huge long-winded answer, but that to me is, and I'll say one other bit, which is something I say a lot, is I was talking to my dad a few years back, and I said, you know, I was frustrated about something, and I was like, yeah, it's just, man, life is really hard. And he was like, yeah, it is really hard. And I was like, yeah, and it sucks. And he was like, no, life is hard, but that doesn't mean it's bad. Hard and bad aren't the same thing. And I think that's the growth mindset. Is like, flow state is ease and challenge. It's a balance of those two things.
I think it's interesting that, so I remember the first time I came in contact, my mother's a big Carol Dweck fan. And
Yeah.
I feel like in the Bay Area, growing or like coming of age in the Bay Area, there's a lot of like, I think a lot of the ideologies are sort of in line with a growth mindset. I think it was maybe last year where I I read Quit by Annie Duke. And I'm a big Annie Duke fan because there's something about her that I just think is well, I mean, she's brilliant, but
Yeah.
are you familiar with her work at all?
No, but I have a guess of where you might be going, and it's an interesting place.
Oh, I mean, I don't know if it's interesting, but the
Oh,
idea of like we put all this emphasis as a culture on going through the hard things, but actually, if you take an inventory, statistically, it's more influential or has more sort of guidance or just as much on
yeah.
the things that you let go of or the things that you kind of know when to say no on. And so
Yeah.
I was curious if, I mean, for me, I think the only thing I can think of, like the easiest thing to think about is like dating.
Yeah.
When you're dating someone at the beginning of a relationship, like you would never, if it was like a hard start, you would never
True.
continue
Very true.
going. Um, but does that necessarily, I mean, I think it's difficult for me to know when things are too hard. And I think that knowing when to stop is also an interesting sort of way to think about things.
I
Um,
completely agree.
so I mean, everything is always this. I like that you tied it back around to sort of this balance between like ease and hardship and finding that sort of equilibrium there that like lets you stay interested and be in that flow state, but also isn't too hard that it's crippling or too easy that it's boring kind of a situation.
I completely agree. And actually, because I'm a big like question asker. So anytime I'm presented with a framework like the growth mindset, my brain instantly goes to like basically what you just said, which is, well, how do you know, like, how do you not end up as the person on American Idol who cannot sing, but will never give up this dream that they definitely should give up, right? Like, how do you know the difference? And creatively, for myself, the way that I do that is project based learning. And essentially, what I try to do, and again, this is my Indiana raised in pop culture voice coming out, where
I love it.
I
Follow
think
it.
that like it's a both a Dory from Finding Dory or Finding Nemo, just keep swimming, but mixed with Ross from Friends pivoting. And so it's just keep pivoting. And the way that you think, the way you navigate that, or the way I have that's been useful, is based on, if you have a hunch of like, I want to try kids' books, or I want to try podcasting, or I want to, whatever it is. And you're like, I think I really want to do that. Based on the level of certainty, that's how committed I will be to a particular attempt and I'll make it a project. So when I thought I want to make illustrations for book covers for fiction, I was the amount of certainty I had to commit to that road was, I'm going to do 5 new book covers for books from the public domain, and I'm going to screen print them. And And I'm glad that I didn't make a bigger commitment, because I made the first one and it was Moby Dick. And I was really proud of the image. I thought it was really cool. And I posted it online. This was like 2013 or 2011, maybe. I don't know, something like that. And I was like, yo, check this out. And everybody, like someone instantly was like, oh, this is really cool. What did you think of the book? And I was like, oh, I didn't read the book, because I don't read a ton of fiction. And so I'm one poster into this project that I've committed to, and realize, like, hold on, this is probably not the right direction for me. And, I think it was good, like, try to finish the project, gather more data. Then you're like, at least sure that this is something you want to cross off the list, which is a type of progress. But then after you finish that project, you can reassess. You can be like, okay, well, how'd that go? What did you think? And then when I did the podcast, I kind of made a personal commitment that was much bigger than that, because I thought I had a lot of evidence that this would be a thing worth sticking to for an extended period of time, both because I loved it and also because I thought it was in the direction that I wanted to go. And so when I started the podcast, unlike that project where I committed to like 5 pieces, I had committed to myself to do like 100 episodes. And so,
wow, that's a lot.
It's a lot. It's it's over 2 years of podcasting, but I just knew that I was 10 years or something into my creative journey, and it just had so many pieces that I was like, I was already a huge podcast fan, and it was in the direction of all the things I wanted to do creatively. And I'm glad that I committed to that 100 episodes, because halfway through, the first year, we had very, very, very few listeners. And so had I not had a commitment, I would have definitely, and not only that, there was just so many things that were out of my comfort zone and knowledge around, the audio side, and getting to do interviews, and so there were so many things, and there were so many things that would go wrong. And so, I think that's the way I think about it, because you hear those it's about holding that tension of opposites between, is it, you can read whole books about just pivot all the time, like never stop giving up. And then you can read a book about, growth mindset, or Angela Duckworth, the grit thing, like where she's like, never give up. And you're like, okay, I think project-based commitments is a good like synthesis of those two things.
Okay, this is like a total tangent, but I have to ask you this because it seems as if we might be reading the same material in our off hours. Yeah. Who are you reading right now?
Well, I gave myself a pretty serious challenge recently to read more fiction, and so I've been kind of on a fiction kick, but I before that I was reading Carl Jung's Man and His Symbols, and that was like to overstate it, a life-changing book. I was obsessed with it. But now I'm almost through East of Eden, and that's just been better than I ever imagined, because fiction's kind of a hard sell to me, but John Steinbeck is I just love the writing and all the themes and all that.
What do you think it is about fiction that you're not attracted to?
I think it's 2 things. I think one of the reasons I'm so attracted to it now is, like I said earlier, I'm a big questioner. So I'm always like asking why, like, why are we doing this? It's the same as like, I wish when I was a kid, someone would have if I'm going to learn guitar, I need to start with, this is the song we're trying to learn. So I can be like, okay, I want to learn these chords. I can't just, do the monotony of, okay, do the worksheet because you have to. I need more intrinsic motivation for me to do something. And so, like I wish in school that they would have said like math is the secret code of the universe. Like that's how we're able to see galaxies away because of math. That's how we have microchips. Like I feel like, I don't know if that would have made a difference, but I feel like it might have if I had known like this is an amazing, like mystical thing almost. And so I think fiction is becoming much more interesting to me because I've spent the past 10 years, like probably mostly reading about story and story structure, both because I make picture books, but then also because in the podcast and in my public speaking, I'm always telling stories and analogies and metaphors. And I just became really, really, really hyper focused on story and everything about that. And I think eventually it's almost like I had to understand, like, why would you read fiction? Other than it's like, okay, maybe it's fun for some people, maybe it isn't, whatever. I think I wanted to know why. And now I feel like story's almost like my religion. And so I can fathom reading it and I understand why I'm spending time doing that. And then I think the other reason is because, you know, my personal definition of story is a hybrid of something that Brian McDonald said, who he's like a story guy, and then Ira Glass said, and I combined it to say, for me, I really think a story is like a promise of a series of events that ends in a surprise. And I could, dive in and unpick what I mean by that. But essentially it's like Brian McDonald would say, if you look up the definition of a story, it says a series of events. But he's like, if you came into the office and you're like, oh man, I got a story for you. This morning, I got my coffee, I got into my car, and then guess what? I came to work. You'd be like, that's not a story. I don't know what a story is, but I know it's not just a series of events. And so he said it's a story it's a series of events that ends in a conclusion. But I actually think the only time a story is satisfying is if that conclusion is somewhat of a surprise that's meaningful. And so I think the other reason I don't like fiction typically, or I haven't, is that I don't think a lot of authors keep that promise. And so it's literally like someone comes into the office and they're like, I have a story for you. And then they go on and on and on for 200 pages. And you're waiting to know, why is this a story and not just a series of events? And there's just too many times where you would get to the end of spending so long reading a book and you're like, I don't know well, was that a story? Like, so I think that's just my own, that's my own kind of taste maybe. But yeah, I think I have a hard time just spending that much time doing something. And I'm just not, there has to be a lot of trust if you give someone that much of your life, because books, at least I don't read super fast. So books take a long time,
But something you said a little bit ago, that story is your religion. And I was wondering if you could kind of, I know we don't have that much time, but I'm fascinated by what you might have meant by that.
Sure. And I'm saying it as a joke, but I don't really think it is a joke.
It can be both.
It is both. Yeah, it's both. I okay. So I got about 10 years ago, I got really, like I said, I got really obsessed with story. And my entry point was kind of the typical way. I got really into the hero's journey and Joseph Campbell and all that. And the reason was because so many popular culture stories that really model and embody the hero's journey just had such a deep impact on me. And then I remember, this is I'm trying to pick the right doors to open here just in time wise. But I remember just having so many experiences with the hero's journey and having these everyone's had that feeling that I talked about earlier, where when I read The Little Prince, or when there's movies that you go see, and when you walk in the movie theater, you come out a different person. You're like, something happened to me. It was like a conversion. And essentially I realized like that I started thinking about how so many of these stories are essentially the same stories that are told in religious settings all across the world. They're the same stories. And I started to think about like, well, okay, well, what if instead of calling them Buddha or Jesus or whatever whichever religion you want to choose, what if you just change their names to Luke Skywalker and Harry Potter and Moana and whatever? Like, would it have the same effect on your psyche? And then I remembered that in a lot of the cases, the names that we use for those religious figures weren't their name. Like, that's like, Jesus wasn't his name, for instance.
Was it?
No, his name was Yeshua, but even that, we're probably not saying it the way that they said it. And so,
okay.
So that thought is kind of what led me down this story obsessed road, because I realized like, oh, that's what all religions are already doing. We're already telling the same story with different names. And so I just became really obsessed with like the power of the story rather than the specifics. And then also the way that throughout time, we've had to like do like a rebrand of these stories to give it fresh meaning for people. And so I just became, just really enamored with how story holds a culture together and then guides a culture and then, reminds us of the things that matter about humanity. And then even like, I've heard, I don't know anything about neuroscience, but as far as I know, there's not a good consensus about like what we are, like what consciousness is. And my favorite definition I've heard though is it's billions of neurons telling a story. They're just like, okay, we're Andy. That's who we are. This is kind of what we're like. And that's all you are, is just what these neurons are telling the story of. And so I think that pretty much sums up, like, that's kind of how I think about life. And I also think like, if you go, 1,000 years into the future, if people are still around then, and they can look back at us now, I think they're going to think our churches were Disney World, like that. Those were the huge things that we built. And so, for better or worse, like those are based on the stories that we tell. So I think that's kind of what I mean by that.
Hey, thank you so much for going on that ride. There were so many things I was like, oh, I really want to dig into this, but I do want to, something that came up for me was I wanted to ask you how you felt about AI right now. And this is a two-part question. One, in terms of like illustration or creative power, and then two, AI and consciousness.
Yeah. So, I mean, I have given it a lot of thought.
I figured you did.
I have given a lot of thought. Being an illustrator, it's a big conversation. And I think it's also, there's so many pieces of it that are incredibly interesting and really frightening in a whole bunch of ways, the more that you kind of dive in and think about it. But now I'll just say, I'm just going to credit the person, even though I'm not a fan of this person. So
okay. Love it.
It's Jeff Bezos. I'm not a Jeff Bezos bro or like whatever. I don't get down with that. But he said, I heard something that he said that I thought, this is really relevant to these kinds of conversations. And for better or, definitely worse, I think one of the reasons Amazon is what it is this idea, which he said, anytime anyone asks him like to predict the future. He refuses to do it because I think there's another quote by somebody else who says, if you're wrong, you look like an idiot. Oh, that's a different thing. That's if you predict the end of the world. So if you're wrong, you're an idiot. If you're right, you're not there to celebrate it. That's a whole other thing.
Oh,
But
I like that.
yeah,
Not like that too.
it's terrible. But he said that anytime, because he's in e-commerce world, he's constantly asked like, what's the next thing? Like, whatever. And he would say that he refuses to ever predict the future. But what he does do is try to predict what is likely to never change because it hasn't changed this far. And so I think that when it comes to AI, there's a piece of it that I think is really has some potential to do incredible things in the art world in a way that has nothing to do with AI, which is AI. I don't think that art is, for the most part, about impressing people. But I think that the majority of mainstream people think that is the point of art. That the point of art is that this artist can do something that nobody else can do. Like just, you can, there's shred a guitar like at the craziest speeds, or photorealistic painting, which I'm not dissing those things. I just don't think that's why humans love art. I think that what humans love about art is connecting with people, connecting internally in a way that there is no other way to connect. And so I think what is interesting, the one positive I think that could happen from AI is so good at making really impressive stuff faster than humans will ever make. There is no competition. And it makes me excited because I'm like, well, maybe we'll quit trying to compete to impress people. Like maybe instead we'll get more obsessed with connection. And like I don't know about you, but the things that connect to me are the stuff that looks kind of terrible. Like probably my favorite artist is David Shrigley. And I actually don't think his art looks terrible. I think it looks gorgeous, but I loved that it looks like so human. And I think that I wonder if that will have an impact on how people consume art, because we'll have lost the competition to make impressive stuff. And maybe the kind of art I like will become more popular because it'll be like, well, this was made by a person. And you're like, whoa, okay, that's great. And you can tell because it's not very good. Like I love that. And I think, the two other things I get like really, well, I saw this on Twitter, but I just tell everybody it anyway, because I don't know who said it, but sorry, I can't attribute it to the right person. But that like we've had self-playing pianos, like since the old times. Nobody wants to watch that. Nobody wants to watch a piano that's programmed to play a song. Like art is about humans connecting to humans. And I think you see this too in like in the way that we have a really hard time disconnecting the art from the artist, because we don't want to consume art from someone who seems inhumane. And so that's great news when it comes to robots, because they're very inhumane. We want the humanity. So that's the thing I've thought about a lot. I think there's a lot of dark, bad things and a lot of interesting things too, but that's the main thing that's been kind of floating around in my head.
Oh no, I love that it's hopeful. It's beautiful. And for me, I think when I think about it from the vantage point of like, I had never sort of imagined how universal basic income, which I feel like is, I don't know how you feel about that, but I feel like it's going to be a necessity rather rapidly.
Yeah.
If we want to continue on with humans existing.
Same. Totally agree.
And I think about like how exciting that would be for art to not to have art, the refocusing of it on to human connection and storytelling and sort of creating this cultural narrative that we want to live by. Which is I'm really hopeful about that. So Andy, we're so out of time. You are amazing. Thank you so much for doing this with me. And I'll put links to, I wanted to just mention really quick the episode that you talked about really quick for your podcast, Creative Pep Talk.
Yeah.
Was it 10 things? What was the
Yeah,
title of it
it's
again?
episode 349, and it's the Creative Pep Talk, 10 Rules of a Thriving Creative Practice. And I called it Creative Pep Talks because they're not the rules. They're just my go-to. These are I'm kind of taking a leaf from do you know Sister Karita Kent?
Mm-hmm.
Like she had her class rules,
Mm-hmm.
and this is kind of my class rules and how I do my practice. And I think it's a good like starting point to enter the podcast.
Love it. Okay, so I'll put a link to the podcast. I'll also put Karita Kent's rules just for people who
Okay.
haven't seen them. I think they're great. They're kind of like an art school staple. Best of luck, Andy, with everything in your life. And thank you so much. It was really, really inspiring talking to you. And I could have listened to you for much longer. So take
Thank you
care.
for having me. And we're gonna have to get you on the show to I'd love to hear more from you because you have so good questions that I couldn't shut up. So
Oh, so for me, I was thinking about it when you were talking about it, and I was like, oh, I just really like hearing about what other people have to say. Because like it's interesting because like when you think about the people that you admire and how they shape how you see yourself, and I just get this sort of like it's weirdly it's learning about myself as well, listening to you speak and your life experience and how you sort of explain, going back to the fundamental question of why are we here? Why are we doing these things is something that I'm endlessly curious about. So thank you so much, Andy. Take care. Best of luck for the new school year with your family.
thanks. You too.